Good morning. Welcome everyone to our breakfast briefing on Culture is Real. I am Leah Deering of Berman, Fink, Van Horn. I have with me today Dr. Donte Vaughn of CultureWorx. We are very thankful that you could join us today and have this conversation on workplace management culture.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
We're excited today for another reason too. So, we've had COVID, we're getting back in person. This is our second breakfast briefing that we've invited folks back into the office to join us live and in person. It's a big part of these breakfast briefings and what we try to do because we're trying to start a conversation. We bring you topics that are important to a variety of businesses, a variety of industries, and it's important content, and we do a great job, or we try to do a great job of fostering conversations. So even though some of you are on the web and some of you are here with us in person today, we want to have a conversation with you. We have a chat bar on the Zoom. You can ask questions. Jen's back there and is going to help us out today with reading those questions throughout the presentation today. Those of you that are here with us in person, feel free to raise your hand. Audience participation is encouraged, and we hope that you guys get as much out of this today as we think you will. I have another really exciting announcement. Those of you may not know, 2022 is Berman, Fink, Van Horn's 25th anniversary. And we have a lot of exciting things. Oh, thank you. A lot of exciting things are happening this year. You're getting a sneak peek today. You are VIPs. You're getting to be the first ones to see, oh, maybe you're not, there it is. The first ones to see our new brand, our new logo that's going to be rolled out with some other branding material this year. We also are going to have a big move. We're moving up to the 16th floor. We're staying here in Prominence. But we have this beautiful new space that's going to be rolled out, and look for an invitation to a launch for that space and a celebration of our 25th anniversary that'll happen this fall. So, without further ado, let me tell you about Dr. Vaughn.
Oh boy.
Dr. Vaughn wears a lot of hats. He is a father, he is a husband, he is a business owner, a manager, an employee, and a writer. He wrote a great book that is the foundation of part of what we're going to talk about today. But that's not actually how I got to know Dr. Vaughn. I've seen him speak several times. And how I know Dr. Vaughn is he is a passionate advocate for the topic he is here to share with you today. He is a passionate advocate for coming into companies and helping them align the company values to improve the employee experience, the customer experience, and to overall increase productivity and, it's a little cheesy, but happiness, right? A happy workplace where everybody is in alignment and moving the same direction. That is no easy feat, and anyone who has managed people or managed a business knows that's a difficult thing to achieve. And Dr. Vaughn today is hopefully going to give us some keys to unlock that success in our own businesses. And without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Vaughn and would ask that you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do in the world.
Awesome, Leah. I appreciate the introduction. I don't know that I could do better than that introduction. So as Leah shared, I'm the Chief Executive Officer for a company called CultureWorx. And how you articulated it is very much what drives our purpose and our mission, right? We believe that company culture is rooted in how leaders within an organization engage, how they interact, what drives their decision making every day, right? And it influences the experience, as you shared, of the employees, of the customer, and even their experience as leadership peers, right? So how do we mobilize them in a way that fosters this culture? And a lot of this conversation has to do with integrity behind that culture. So in my role as CEO, I have two managing partners in the business. You all know them very well, Randall Powers and Sean Hart. Sean Hart's the CEO of our sister company, Powers. And we all are impassioned around this notion that culture doesn't have to be this intangible thing. Right? When you hear this word culture, it's become this popularized, a notion that arbitrarily exists in business. And we're saying no, it's something that can be managed intentionally and with integrity. And we're in a place in the market now where where organizations are being challenged to prove or validate that this culture that they claim actually exists, right? And that's what's rooted in the work that we do at CultureWorx and in my role as the principal in the business.
So let's take a step back, because you mentioned Mr. Powers and Mr. Hart and the Powers Company, and we have worked with them a long time. They're what we would think of as a traditional consulting firm, right?
Sure.
They come in, for example, warehouse space, and they say, change some equipment, you need more employees here, change these operations and you'll improve efficiency. Is that a fair assessment of a high level?
You know, high level to some extent. I think the caveat would be that they've always understood the importance that the leadership behavior, you know, has in impacting those systems and processes that you're referring to. But yeah, traditionally, that's their sort of lane, but they very much adopt this conversation around leadership behavioral change and this notion of culture performance management.
And that's what differentiates them, and is sort of the next frontier in how CultureWorx was born.
You bet.
There's another step beyond having the
Absolutely.
best equipment. There's another step behind having the next set of processes, and that companies can achieve a higher level of efficiency, productivity, better retention of employees if they address this just the same as they would as having the right piece of equipment in the warehouse.
Yes. You're referring to what we speak to in the book as is operationalizing culture. So we're trying to appeal to business leaders to say, hey, the same way you look at other functions or systems in your business, it's the same way that you can approach managing your culture and optimizing it. It doesn't have to be this intangible or arbitrary or organic thing that exists in your business, right? It's like any business. I want to be able to predict to some extent the impact that these various systems in my business will have and how it drives results. Well, that applies in the world of culture, or culture performance management, as we call it.
Okay, so I have my first Ask the Audience question. I'm going to get you going first thing this morning. What do you associate with a company that has great culture? What's a company that you interact with and you think, gosh, this company has a great culture, I identify with it, I have a positive experience, it's consistent? Brett? Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A, that is always the first one that comes to mind. And I think we would say that operationally and culturally, they're at the top of their game. Anybody else have any suggestions? Jen, anyone online yet? Not yet? Chick-fil-A is a great example.
Sure.
Are there any tips that, off the top of your head, you could say we could take from the Chick-fil-A model and apply in our own businesses?
You know, when we think, Chick-fil-A comes up often in our world, right? And when you think about what stands out about Chick-fil-A, actually, I want to reverse back to the audience for a second. Why'd you say Chick-fil-A?
Well, they've developed a culture of treating the customer in a certain way, but treating each other in a certain way.
Will you repeat that for them?
So for those that didn't hear, he said they've developed a culture where the customers and the employees are treated in a positive way, right? Oftentimes when we think about culture, we think about how people are treated, or at least the experience they get from how they're treated. And in the reality, that's rooted in a standard that Chick-fil-A has set for that experience. So treatment just doesn't happen. You're speaking to a lagging indicator of how a leader and how a peer has chosen to engage and interact with someone. Now, it's perpetuated an experience for them, but Chick-fil-A has systematically said, hey, I'm going to set a standard for how I want you to greet the employee, how I want you to engage with prospective employees, how I want you to engage with the customer, and then I'm going to put systems and mechanisms for sustainability around you to support that and reinforce that in real time, right? And that's the premise behind this operationalized culture. Imagine saying that I want this experience for my business. Theoretically, hypothetically, but not putting the mechanisms in place to ensure that you can realize that vision that you have for your business. Most organizations do just that. These core values are really important to me. My founding fathers of my business said that integrity and inclusion and all these things are important. Why? What's the impact? And can I articulate that in a way that I can then mobilize my leaders and how they show up and how they engage? Chick-fil-A's done a very good job in organizing methodically. Here are our core values. Even to the extent that it was contrary to certain people in the market, it didn't matter. You remember some of the controversies that came out of the decisions they were making in their business, and they remained true to their core values, said, this is how it looks in real time, right? And that's the premise behind a lot of what we do in our business and reinforcing. That's this whole notion of culture performance management. And that's what we speak about in the book.
So, should we all just adopt the Chick-fil-A model? Is that the right culture?
Great question. I don't have any ideological view on what the right culture is. Your right culture really stands for, look, if you are driven by a purpose, you have a clear vision and a mission for your organization, you have outcomes that you expect, you have impact that you're trying to make through a product, through a service. Your culture is really rooted in how you believe the various engagements and interactions and decision making will help you realize that outcome. So all we're saying is, hey, understand what that culture is, rooted in your core values, specific in the behaviors that underpin those core values, that should be actionable, that can drive the outcomes that you want in your business. It should be rooted in your ability to optimize your performance, whatever value that may be. It works for Chick-fil-A. It may not work in your business. But the systematic approach that they've taken in being clear about those behavioral standards and expectations, and then implementing them, integrating them in how they operate every day, from the time the customer's greeted to the time that they're given their product, and all the pieces in between operationally are all rooted in that system.
And I think that we can extrapolate from that one of the values it brings is the employees understand what's expected of them.
Absolutely.
There is no question at Chick-fil-A, whether you're the customer or you're internally working, what the company stands for, what its value system is, and how they're going to be judged, rewarded, and valued as employees. And that's another intangible benefit of these culture management policies and putting them in place.
You got it.
And so let's say we've bought in, Dr. Vaughn, we agree with you that's important, we see the results out there. I'm a manager, a business owner, and I said, well, how do I even figure out what my company culture is? How do I start? What's step one?
Another great question. I think now we have a formalized process to assess an organization's culture and understand the factors that influence those interactions and decision making. What are those behaviors that we can observe that have contributed to the success of a business and even the created opportunities or fostered failures in the business? I think that's a great way to start. Just if you've been operational and you've seen success in your organization, take a step back. Even if you have these prescribed core values that you believe are important to your business, hold them steady, but take a step back and just observe the business with the level of sincerity and authenticity and candid reflection. What do I observe from my leaders that have perpetuated my success as an organization, and what has contributed to challenges, obstacles, failures, whatever? Right? The idea would be to start there, because that becomes the baseline for this experience that you're fostering with your employees, with your customers. So we always want to spend some time in just identifying, and you could do what we call a cultural SWOT analysis, right? And if you're familiar with the SWOT analysis, right, that evaluation of the internal and external factors that are influencing outcomes in my business. What are the strengths? What are the opportunities? What are the weaknesses? And what are the threats? Well, that applies to leadership behavior just as much. And it's a hard conversation because it starts at the top. So oftentimes the work that we do begins with the founding members of an organization, where we say, listen, we say in the book, you promote what you permit, right? And it starts all the way at the top. So look at those things. Understand, are there toxicities that exist in our organization that we've perpetuated at various levels? Because if I can't get in front of those elephants, as we call them, then it's difficult to claim this culture we're trying to foster. Guess what that does? It perpetuates discontentment, frustration. Frankly, you lose integrity. Because you have these core values on your wall that you could probably blow the dust off of the picture frames of, and you don't have examples of how those things are actually embodied in the business. And that's a good starting point. There's a lot more work that needs to happen from there, but that's a way to say, what's really broken in my business as it relates to how my leaders show up, even if I'm profitable? Because oftentimes we justify our dysfunctional culture as, well, look, we're profitable. I may have steamrolled 20 people to get here, but I'm profitable. I'm fulfilling my stakeholders' expectations or my board's expectations. But when you start to peel back the onion, you realize that these toxicities and these things don't really align with this culture I claim in the business, which is why fundamentally you're not an employer of choice. You fail to attract millennial talent into your business. All those other arbitrary challenges that organizations face.
So those of you that have worked with us, and many of you online and here in the room today know that Berman, Fink, Van Horn does a lot in the area of non-compete work. And so our day in and day out involves high-level managers often moving from company A to company B. And what I have seen and observed in my practice is that while companies get very upset when key talent leaves because they're talented, they get really upset when that key talent are the individuals that are the glue people. They're the people that have that innate leadership skill, that build teams, that build loyalty in teams. Mm-hmm. And it's a person in the organization mm-hmm. that created that, not the organization's culture.
Yes.
And so how do you come into a company, identify those people or the values that, and then push that out company-wide? How do you train other leaders to exemplify those same qualities and characteristics?
That you're getting at sort of rooted in the importance of systematically approaching this. The reality is those culture change agents in your organization, sometimes the founders, sometimes the leader you hired after the fact, but those culture change agents are able to have the power of influence that they have because of the way they've approached behaviorally their engagements, their interactions, and their decision making. Understanding those behavioral characteristics and traits, and then applying them against a broader picture of, okay, that individual is exhibiting represents this core value that drives our success. Now, I'm going to then take those behavioral traits or skills or competencies, I want to approach them in a more standardized way. It becomes a construct or profile for leaders in your organization. So sometimes you can take those change agents and evaluate. That goes back to my notion of standing back and exploring, what am I seeing from these leaders that are having such a great impact? It's not about the individual. A lot of clients ask us, well, I don't want to be so prescriptive in how I expect my leaders to behave or engage or interact. We say, wait a minute, you became prescriptive the minute you put these core values on the wall. Right now, take that aside, stylistically, we all are unique and different in our approach. My style of leadership may be different than yours, Leah, stylistically. But our actions, our decision making, how we choose to engage and interact, those things are rooted in the same core values within an organization because that's the standard. That means I have to integrate those behavioral standards in everything from my job descriptions, to my interview protocols, when I'm sourcing candidates, to their performance appraisals, right? Those same behavioral traits, let's talk about that culture change agent as an example. Those behavioral traits that we've seen so much success in should be rooted in how we measure the efficacy of the leaders in our business. If that individual, so it's less about the person. Stylistically, he or she may be different, but behavioral traits, well, that's something that I can standardize and formalize. Now I'm putting integrity. If I said inclusion, or let's use a common core value, trust. If trust is a core value, there are behavioral traits that all leaders must embody to foster trust or trustworthiness. Have I taken those behavioral standards or expectations and formalized them, communicated them, and then went to that leader and said, hey, your ability to embody trust looks like this, and either you are embodying those core value traits or you're not, and we're gonna have a conversation about it. Intentionally, I'm going to be intentional about how you learn it, how you practice it, and how we measure it. And that gets at why this culture performance management approach is so important. Because the reality is the experience I have is going to be rooted in truth. You could give me all the widgets and trinkets and throw as many pool parties and donut drives as you want. My experience is my experience. So any way you flip it, I have to be intentional about engaging you in a way that I claim. Otherwise, it won't be.
Dr. Vaughn, donuts make everyone's experience better.
Fair.
There is no argument on that.
Fair.
But you do touch on a really important point, which is that you can't just say, here are my core values, and put some posters on the wall and have a party and hand out lemonade and donuts and expect everything to just work really well.
Exactly.
You have to follow up, and then you have to measure results. So how do I measure a thing like trust or reliability or employee engagement with their manager?
Sure. We get that question all the time. Now, and we should probably go to slide 2 for this part of the conversation. It's a nice visual reference to what I'm speaking to. And I'm talking about this culture performance management methodology that my partners and I developed. And these 7 pillars really speak to this notion of being clear about our value system, defining those values in the way that they become actionable and tangible, mapping them to how I operate my business every day. You want to get intentional is when you understand, where does culture happen? It happens at the point of engagement, interaction, and decision making. Outside of that, where is culture really fostered without those exchanges, those cultural connections as we speak to them in the book? So I've done all those things. Now I'm being intentional about learning and practice. And that's where we get closer to measurement. It's like any behavioral change. You know, my partner does a better job in this analogy, but if anyone ever played sports in school, right? If you play sports, the greatest impact in your development, behaviorally or in your skill or competency in those sports, was either in practice, but more specifically during the game. When the coach came out to the field, or when you went back to the dugout, or when you went back to the sideline, and they said, hey, I'm watching your posture, I'm watching your body position, I'm watching these things, and you need to course correct because you're not having the greatest impact on your swing, right? It's that real-time sort of experiential learning that fosters that. Guess what that feedback starts to become? A point of measurement. An opportunity for me, in the midst of being intentional about practicing these behaviors that relate to my core values, my own self-reflection becomes a point of measurement. We're not talking about the lagging indicator of, hey, employee, how was your experience last 6 months with so-and-so leader who may or may not be with my organization anymore, and then try to generalize those experiences. We're talking about measuring your actual intentional practice of that behavior. So we recommend, what are your team leaders doing to provide insight and feedback to the team member as it relates to their behaviors, how they're showing up, how they're actually embodying these actionable behaviors that relate to your core values. If you're not, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we say we want to improve culture. We're doing it by looking at lagging indicators of culture. When you look at Gallup surveys over the last almost 2 decades, And if you're familiar with any of their surveys, they speak to employee engagement, national employee engagement rates. And we get excited when they say we have a 0.5% improvement in national employee engagement rate, right? Similar to our unemployment rate, right? We get excited about these numbers when in fact, we've been stagnant over the last 20 years, 31%, 32%, 33%. Why? It's because we're measuring the wrong thing. And I'll take wrong back. That sounds negative. We're measuring an indicator that doesn't necessarily align with actual workplace culture in the context of how it relates to my business and how it relates to how my leaders are engaging and interacting and having real impact. They've been stagnant because the strategies that come after those employee engagement results are often not rooted in the heart of what's driving the experience in the first place, which is the leader's behavior. I have to get at that. I have to get at that while they're on the field swinging the bat. Not after the game, actually after the season, because most employee engagement surveys are rooted in, some cyclical, quarterly or annual cycle. That's late, right? So when we talk about measurement, it's really about measuring in real time, how are my leaders engaging, how are they interacting, and then what the impact that has on business outcomes. And then there are those lagging indicators that you can measure in shorter interval. Am I seeing an impact in my employee retention rates? Am I seeing an impact in my customer satisfaction scores? Am I seeing an impact in my number of open positions? Do I have a referral program in my business, and am I seeing an uptick in employees willing to refer others in the community to my organization? These are all indicators of if you fostered a positive workplace culture. I can go statistically all day. Statistically, yes. I get this question a lot when I'm doing these engagements where I'm asked, hey, millennials, what do they care most about? Right? All these millennials. And the reality is, most individuals, not just millennials, but there's been an emergence of and shift in the workplace where over 55% of the working population are of this millennial generation now. And there's a connection to realize what Maslow realized 100 years ago, which is foundationally, our hierarchy of needs says we are rooted in feeling a sense of beyond safety and security and our physical well-being is sense of connection, purpose, belonging. That's always been the case. Now, this notion of monetary incentive is important. A living wage is important. We see a lot of conversations going on in the business. But beyond that, we can have all the wage compression in the world. What happens next? What people really care about is their experience. And who's responsible for that experience? The leader.
So, I know you're out there doing this in the real world.
Yeah.
You're not just here speaking to people about this. You're actually out there doing. Can you give our audience an example of, anonymously, of course, of a company you've worked with that has gone in, implemented a specific change in culture or methodology around culture and improved retention of their employees? Sure.
I have a number of examples. We have a client who, family owned and operated, has seen significant amount of success in the world of food manufacturing. And what they acknowledged was they'd put a lot of emphasis and investment in assets, streamlining equipment, optimizing through lean management and other principles how they manufacture and how they drive efficiency or productivity. But they hit a wall and they couldn't understand where's the wall. Through an evaluation of their frontline leaders, what was quickly realized was Yes, you have become extremely efficient in driving daily execution from a widget point of view. You've maximized the capacities of your equipment. You've lost sight of how your leaders on the front line were actually engaging and interacting with the operators who really touched the product and ensured that these efficiencies could be maintained and sustained. You know, when you think about what you're paying for employees, and we ask leaders this all the time, what do you think you're paying for? Well, I'm paying for them to be productive. And I'm paying for them to apply the skill that they said they had. And what we realized was that is a fundamental disconnect. What you're paying for is their time, right? Because I'm paying the same amount for the unproductive employee as I am the productive one. And then in that time, your leader's responsibility is to draw as much out of them in their potential skill or competency that they possess. How do I manage that? How do I promote it? How do I create communication around it? And what we realized was those frontline leaders, the measure of their success in their mind was what their measure of success was when they were an operator, which was widgets, units. Get it out, get it out, get it out. And the measure of success needed to shift to behaviorally, how are you as a leader fostering the most in how you drive productivity through development, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, to foster this operator's desire to want to give it the most, to be attentive to quality, to do all those things that were important to maximize the potential of the line. So the measure of their success had to change. So what they implemented was shorter interval evaluation surrounding the leadership behavior, not the number of widgets that came off the line. It was more about, have you done, how many walkthroughs have you done? Have you engaged your employees? Where do we stand on training and development? What does the learning curve look like of your employees? How are we ramping up in their productivity over a certain period of time? The measures started to change to become more rooted in the leadership behavior and not just the output, right? And that's just one subtle example of how, one, a mindset shift for what your measure of success is as a leader, and then how do we apply that in an actionable way? And of course, there was other work that had to happen around that. How do we define these behaviors in an actionable way? How do we integrate them into your daily schedule controls and what have you? How do we ensure that the measure of your success from a performance review point of view includes an evaluation of behavioral standards along with sort of that technical execution standard, right? And so that would be an example of how they've been able to, and they saw, I mean, it was about a 22% improvement that they didn't even know they had the capacity for because they've maximized their assets. But it came down to how those leaders were actually engaging with their front line.
I want to take a break, not a break, but reach out to the audience if anyone has any questions right now. Okay. Raise your hand if you do. Happy to have the audience participation. If you don't ask questions, I might ask questions of you, so you've been warned.
That's right. Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Dr. Vaughn's very friendly. So I have a little bit of a different question for you because we've done talks before on this concept, and I think a lot of people have been hearing it in the last couple of years about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. How is this workplace culture management different from that? Is it different from that, I guess, is the basic question. And then I think your answer is going to be yes. And so the follow-up question is, how can it still impact a company's DEI initiatives?
I love this question. So I believe we see culture performance management as the system to actually ensure any of the core values in an organization can be actually realized and executed on, including diversity, equity, and inclusion. We don't have any ideological view on what those values should be. But let's speak about DEI. The premise surrounding diversity or equity and inclusion is typically or should be rooted in an organization's investment in their strategies, their systems, the processes that foster diversification within the organization, not just by the demographic of employees, but diversification across all areas of their business. Similarly, equity and inclusion. Equity not just in the opportunities or that exist in an organization, but equity in your supplier realm, equity in other aspects of fostering access and inclusion accordingly. Managing DEI in an organization, if you want to drive equity, the foundation of driving equity, for example, is rooted in establishing consistency in how my leaders engage, how they interact, and how they make decisions. When you think about any debate around equitable treatment or equal opportunity that exists, is rooted in, was I engaged the same way someone else was? Was I interacted with in a consistent manner as others? Are the decisions that are being made in my organization done so with consistency and fairness accordingly? Well, having a system and a process around how you mobilize your leaders to have standard in those engagements, interactions, and decision makings is really foundationally important to foster any equity in an organization, right? So I think it's important. We often kind of get lost in trying to symptomatically treat these breakdowns in DEI in an organization, or let's just speak to equity or inclusion in an organization, when fundamentally it's because have you actually established a standard for your leaders and ensure that they understand any diversion from meeting this behavioral expectation or standard will not be tolerated in our organization. We can put as many campaigns and posters and find select people in our organization to take a picture and put on our website. But fundamentally, do I have a system and a standard by which everyone, from the CEO on down, can reference to say, wait a minute, I have to be rooted in this? Because then we'll speak to the attorneys in the room. If I've documented it, I've formalized it, I've mobilized my organization around it, I've fostered training around it, we develop software in our organization as part of our developmental tools. I've invested in software, systems. Your Honor, I've done everything, my client's organization has done everything they could possibly do to foster an equitable work environment. I've put systems in place, standards in place, I formalized it. That comes down to behavioral standards for all of my leaders. My job descriptions reflect it, my performance reviews reflect it. All these things I've done to foster this, right, to the extent that I can control it. It doesn't have to be this intangible thing that I can only do by creating some facade for what exists in my organization. No, I have systems and processes to ensure it, right? It's sort of quality control versus quality assurance, and we speak about that in the book as well.
Mr. Winkler, who's here with us today, and I spend a lot of time on the phone with companies that have employees that are unhappy for some reason. It's part of what we do. It's inevitable. But you know, a truth out of many years of counseling is you've hurt someone's feelings because you've treated them differently and you've made them feel different. Whether that was intentional or not is, you know, an open question when you're on both sides of the room.
Sure.
But a lot of companies don't realize, or their managers don't even realize,
that's right,
that they're treating people differently, or that they're treating people in a manner that might make them feel less valued, which is impacting productivity. It's increasing claims sometimes.
Sure.
And it sounds like this sort of system can help eliminate that, or at least train managers in a way to be more conscientious about how they're interacting with everybody within the company.
Oh yeah, you're speaking of what we call cultural consciousness. Look, I can't correct a behavior that I'm not aware of, or I'm not aware of the impact that it's having. If you go to the 7 pillars, what we speak about is, look, just because I have these core values, and maybe I've gone through the effort of defining them and trying to make them actionable, that doesn't mean the leader actually understands how to apply those standards of practice in day to day. So what do I do? How do I foster their awareness? We need a point of, if you want behavioral change, you need a point of self-reflection or self-awareness, And you need a point of external, trustworthy, unbiased criticism or constructive criticism or feedback. You need both of those things to help may bring a level of consciousness or awareness, right? Even the notion of just speaking to your core values start to create consciousness, but then telling a person, it looks this way to show up this way. Celebrating your leaders when you observe them engaging in the way that embodies your core values. All of that starts to create awareness and consciousness. Now, when that team leader or an accountability partner says, hey, by the way, I know you were trying to work on driving accountability, and part of driving accountability is promoting discipline. And the fact that you are remaining diligent and reminding your team to follow certain protocols is a form of discipline. You're reinforcing the core values of accountability. Nice job. Celebrating those things. How many leaders do you see having those kind of conversations in the business? That's intentional management of company culture. It's not just this arbitrary, we believe in family. Like, what does that mean? Right?
I hear you on that. It's something we say. We believe in family. Family is important to us.
Right.
Lawyers have a hard time with work-life balance, we say. I think most people do these days. But we say that means that we're at the dinner table and that there's no expectation that our associates are there to the last partner leaves at the day, and that we try to foster that and encourage that through our behaviors, but it's something you have to be very intentional about and you have to repeat, because my honest impression is that people don't believe you. Exactly. They have an expectation that if you're at a law firm, that you're expected to be there 14 hours a day, and you better wait until the lights are going off before you leave your office, and that's not part of our values, and so, but we have to repeatedly display it,
right.
And reinforce it, so that if I came in late and stayed till 7 because I hate Atlanta traffic, nobody else feels like they have to stay that late either.
Exactly. Imagine hiring an associate in your firm. They didn't come from a firm who has that core value or how you've defined that core value. They may have all the best intentions in the world, but don't really know what that looks like or feels like, or how they foster that for themselves or within the organization. There's an opportunity for learning and practice. Now, who's going to be the person? Is Ben going to say, hey, by the way, I appreciate you really trying to show us that you're committed and work hard, and I know this is an important case, but you know what? That email at 1 o'clock in the morning, don't do that again. And here's why. I value your productivity, but we believe in family. Now, family for us means that, are we investing in the time of the people you care about outside of this place? And are you investing in self? So who are you sleeping at 1? Did you schedule it when it went out? Because that's not impressive to us. Like, who's the person who in the organization who says that? Because that starts to drive that.
Ben Fink would say
Good.
So.
And I'm using Ben, I'm learning Ben more, and I believe he would, right? But it takes leaders at the highest of levels to say, hey, the culture we want here is so important that we're going to bring awareness to when your behavior doesn't embody that culture. And that's okay. Not everyone's a cultural fit.
So I want to ask a little different question. We've all experienced COVID the last 2 years. A lot of us have moved to work from home schedules or hybrid schedules. A lot of us are trying to come back to the office, but our touch points are different now than they were 2 years ago. How do we replicate the success we had before, right? So we started off in a room together, we worked together 9 to 5, we developed those relationships. Now we're adding new team members in this more hybrid environment. How do we foster the same sort of culture with a more remote or diverse way that they're working type of workforce?
Sure. We get that question a lot as well. Now, frankly, I like when it comes up because it's rooted in when you have a system or process by which you do things in your organization, it becomes a bit more, you become able to scale it. Right. So when we talk about scaling company culture, if I've integrated these standards of behavioral practice in my day-to-day, then I've integrated it in every point of connection. If that connection is virtual, it's virtual. If it's in person, it's in person. But I'm still holding true to the same standards. Now you have to be a bit more intentional and focused on it. So we recommend things like everything from a culture shout out at the start of the morning to, hey, this week we're focused on the value of X. And we want to ensure that the behaviors associated with that value are being practiced. Let's make sure that we highlight and shout out and recognize when those behaviors are being captured, even in a virtual format. There are ways that you can still be intentional about practicing a culture and learning ways to embody those values without necessarily being in person. I'm a person that responds well to human interaction and being in an environment with people, but that doesn't mean that I can't also foster the culture we drive at CultureWorx with my teams virtually, right? So I think it's still about those points of integration. That's pillar 3, is understanding where those culture connections happen, virtual or in person or hybrid, and then being intentional. Don't just apply these efforts for the people who do come into the office and the people who are virtual are just virtual. I'm gonna be intentional about those virtual folks. All right, if you have a morning huddle virtually with your teams, and what are we doing? I want to understand the agendas that go into those virtual meetings, and am I spending some time being intentional about providing that facilitator feedback about how they facilitated their huddle and how that connected to their embodiment behaviorally of what we wanted in an organization. You know, it's like anything else, right? If I want this culture, then I'm gonna do all that I can to hold people accountable. I want to create ownership and accountability around these behaviors that perpetuate the culture. And that doesn't have to change because we're in a virtual or hybrid environment. Sometimes you just have to be a bit more disciplined in what that looks like, but I'm still going to hold you to it. Just like I hold you to revenue, just like I hold you to execution of a project deliverable or anything else in the business.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to the audience. Does anybody have any questions Davida?
Yes. I guess my question is kind of twofold. So my experience has been sometimes company values can sort of reflect the personality, the ideologies of the person who wrote them, right? Not of the organization or its employees. How does one identify toxic values? Because it seems like in order for you to have change in culture, you start with the value system. So how does someone, a leader, identify, hey, these values themselves are toxic and therefore are kind of cultivating and nurturing a negative culture?
Sure. You know, when I think about core values, fundamentally, those core values, whatever a senior leader believes is important or necessary to drive an outcome, becomes a value for the organization. Now, the behaviors that underpin those values should be relative and connect in driving that outcome. If there are employees who don't respond to a leader's embodiment of those core values, we have to evaluate, one, the profile of the employee. Did I apply a level of due diligence and validating that they are a good fit for my organization? The other side of that is I may have to revisit what I deem important to drive an outcome, because if I'm not getting a positive response from the embodiment of these core values to lead me to a positive outcome, if my employees are disgruntled by these experiences, then something's broken, right? There's no way that I can say these values are important in driving an outcome, but the people responsible for impacting that outcome don't respond to behavior. So something's broken along the way. We always say typically it's a break in system or process, not person. Something's disconnected, and we would encourage an organization to explore that. So when I think about values, there's a reason why we call it a value, because we believe it brings us and it leads us to an outcome. So we have to be sure that there's interconnectivity and relevance to what that looks like. Now, the individual leader and the toxicities that exist within them, that's something that we have to get at. And it may not be necessarily an indication of the core value, but just the individual. And sometimes you have to get at that.
Neil?
Yeah, Dr. Vaughn, you hinted at this in your last response, but maybe you could talk about the process of hiring employees that fit company values and are going to respond behaviorally to the kinds of things that companies implement to drive those values. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that piece of finding the right people that are the right fit.
Most organizations will have a very generalized definition for these values that they believe underpin the culture that exists. And most talent or prospective talent struggle with making a connection to what it means to them, what that would mean to their experience. So part of it is ensuring that there's a level of detail in that definition that has a level of specificity and relevance to the individual in their role. So when we work with organizations, we look at things like their job postings and their job descriptions that they use, even down to their interview protocols. Instead of me asking you, how many years experience do you have operating that piece of equipment? Or how many years experience do you have managing a team? I may ask you something like, tell me a time when you had to reinforce discipline surrounding X, Y, or Z with your team, and what happened when that discipline wasn't sustained in your organization. I'm going to ask you questions that connect to behaviorally how I expect you to show up. So first, I have to validate that you actually have a propensity or you have an attitudinal or behavioral tendency that aligns with my company culture. Most people don't even interview like that. They spend so much time on their academic prowess, on their technical understanding, and they lose sight of validating, do they have these tendencies that will either promote or detract from the culture I want, regardless of how many years experience you have or your academic background, or rather you went to Yale or Harvard, right? So I think it starts there in your acquisition process. And let's say they seem to have relative, the tendencies that match with the culture I want. Then how do I foster their development, their orientation into this culture? Because you understand it, you have a propensity for it, but maybe you had some bad experiences. I want to help you understand what it means to be a BFV law leader, because that may be different than so-and-so Vaughn law, right? So that's where you integrate developmental tools, this learning and practice. But I'm gonna hold you accountable to it. I'm not detracting from the culture I told you that was important to us, but I'm gonna give you an opportunity to foster your own development in those behavioral standards and expectations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
In that same vein, kind of following that question, can you speak a little bit more, about how you begin that implementation process, especially for people who may either come from other company cultures and have habits or behaviors that may not be ideal, or are just kind of jaded and untrustworthy because they've seen a lot of talk and not a lot of walk. So as a millennial, I understand that, and I see that in my peers. So how do you walk them through that transition when you're with a company who wants to make that change?
Can you repeat that question?
Can you repeat that
Yeah.
folks online?
Yeah, so she's asking, how do you implement that change, especially with individuals in an organization who are frankly they don't trust or believe that leaders will actually magically start to embody these values and behave in a manner that aligns with this culture that they claim. Is that a fair restatement? As I said earlier, it absolutely starts at the top. So part of it is, we solicit insights. I think it's important to solicit insights from individuals with whom you're trying to impact by way of this culture, right? That is an important step. And through that solicitation, and I'm not talking about just an employee experience survey, I'm talking about candid, opportunities for individuals to truly share their real, honest, transparent experiences and how leaders may have perpetuated that experience. So getting that real, honest, candid feedback, bringing it to the highest, most leaders in an organization, and then challenging one another, or in this case, we come in and challenge those senior leaders to say, first, before we ever start to talk about expectations across this organization, let's talk about you. How do you believe your actions may or may not have contributed to this outcome that you have in your culture? It requires that honest, authentic look at self before you could ever start to claim that this is a culture you're trying to, because people are not. They'll call you on your BS in a heartbeat. People know, oh, yeah, okay. Right? And you lose integrity quickly. Most organizations have already lost integrity because they've claimed these values, but the employee experience hasn't been indicative of these values that they claim. So, and after we foster this self-reflection and honest dialogue around where the failures have occurred, even in self, as how they show up as a leader, then there's an opportunity to acknowledge it. You start to build trust and credibility through vulnerability and transparency, which means those senior most leaders have to stand up and say, yes, I, Dr. Vaughn, have failed to consistently reinforce these values that are important to us. And I'm working every day to make sure that I mitigate all the factors that influences me failing to embody or live out these values every day. We encourage those type of conversations to happen from the senior most leaders. Hey, I'm not staying in the past. I want to move forward in this, and I need your help. And by doing so, I'm putting a system in place. I'm setting new standards, and I have my own accountability partners in that. Until that happens, I don't care what you put in a poster. I don't care what you reinforce. When you promote what you permit, you're trying to foster this notion of ownership and accountability. When they look up, if they don't see it happening at the top, oh, you'll lose in credibility and momentum as quick as you implemented it.
How do you, let's say you've implemented the system, you've got the credibility, you have leadership that is exemplifying the culture, and you bring in a new team member that is critical and essential, but is reluctant to join the team culture?
Well, I would say first there may have been a breakdown in your decision to bring them on, right? Because if you question the culture that exists in my organization, that if I've done a really good job in articulating this culture and what drives it, meaning how leaders engage and how they interact and the experience you can anticipate and the standards that I set, that should be a part of your decision to join this organization. If you come in after the fact, so let's say you disingenuously just agree with everything I said so you could get the job, because that happens. I just want the job. Well, if you've put mechanisms for the measurement of my success is the embodiment of the core values, then I'm going to quickly stand out. I mean, I won't last long in an organization. I don't have to convince you that this culture is beneficial to you or to the organization at large. I've proven that. You don't get to come and disrupt my culture because you've come in. I don't care how valuable you think you are. Because ultimately, it's like implanting a cancer cell that over time will grow, or you'll start to foster these subcultures that are contrary to what you want in your organization. If you've done the due diligence and validated that this culture is important to realizing your purpose, your vision, your mission, then you won't let anything detract you from that. So I would do my best to not bring on a detractor. Now, yes, am I going to have to prove out what I claim? Well, that'll be natural because it'll be a part of their experience. Will it become a point of reference for them? Because, yeah, we give room for learning and practice. But do you get to then say, but no, that culture is not important. I get to bring my own. That's what you won't be able to do. I'll give you room to learn and understand what it looks like to be this leader from our organization, but you don't get to bring toxicities along the way.
Mr. Fink?
Donte,
yes.
How do you adapt this to a multi-generational workforce? You got the baby boomers, you got millennials, you got the Gen X, Gen Z. Obviously, they're generalizations, right? But each generation has sort of different values, different approaches, different work ethic.
Sure.
Maybe you repeat that for the folks online.
Yeah, so So Ben's question was centered around, in a multi-generational workforce, how do you sort of adapt or adopt, this standard when everyone sort of has a different view on the work, view on the world, view on their role. Is that a fair restatement?
Yeah, in particular, baby boomers.
Baby boomers and millennials, sure. First, there's a honest look we have to have at ourselves as it relates to our own conscious or unconscious biases that we have on all sides of working with a multi-generational team, right? Because the biases will always get in the way of our ability to fully show up with authenticity as it relates to the embodiment of those core values. Oh, millennials are lazy and only want to whatever, right? If you go in with that, then you're going to struggle anyway, anything I say. Similarly, baby boomers don't know technology and they just don't understand, right? So first we just have to be conscious of our own biases. And it's like managing anything. I want to be open about what those are. And then and that's a part of it, right? That's a societal issue. The more that we can be open about our perceptions or misperceptions based on our own experiences and start to have those conversations, now we're in a point where we can actually find some level of understanding. But here's what doesn't change. At the end of the day, we both work for the same organization that reinforces expectations behaviorally. We both have to show up a certain way. Now, my style may be different than yours because of my upbringing and my experiences, but foundationally, my behavioral standards don't change. I don't get to waver from that. But I want to have an open and honest dialogue. And if we can leverage each other in our strengths as we work together in trying to embody these values, man, we're going to see success every time. But I think, Ben, to your question, it's rooted in that acknowledgement that, hey, I don't understand you fully, you don't understand me fully. Here's what I think of you, here's what you think of me, but we both have these behavioral standards that we both have to practice, so let's figure this out. Right? We don't get to bring our biases and our prejudices and then remain true in trying to foster an equitable culture. Like that doesn't work together very well.
Mr. LaBelle?
Yeah, Dr. Vaughn, going back to the prior question about somebody coming into an organization that has different values. I've got this question. Do you ever deal with situations where you have companies that are merging that have different values?
Oh, yes.
And I have a practical situation.
Yeah.
I have a client that is a relatively smaller company, let's say a $100 million a year company, that has been acquired by an international company.
Sure.
And you can imagine the smaller company was family owned, the founders were still there.
Yep.
It was a very warm and supportive culture. And there's been a lot of clashes now.
Sure.
That they're now owned by this international company that maybe doesn't have some of the same values or, do you deal with that situation?
Absolutely, all the time. Yeah. And in fact, it's also part of almost our value proposition of why a system is so important. There's always an acquiring and an acquired, right? Now, typically, the acquiring organization is the one who wants to assert their dominant culture. Now, I would be remiss to say that oftentimes the acquiring company doesn't even know what the culture is or have a system around it. So first, we have to work in that construct. But remember, I go all the way back to what I started with. There are factors that have influenced the success of every operational institution. We always start with, hey, acquiring company, if you want to reinforce this culture that you believe is so important, understand the factors in that smaller organization that have contributed to their success and draw a connection between those factors and the culture that exists in your organization being the acquiring organization. Because you have to bring those individuals along to help them understand how what they've done to lead to their success is exactly in alignment with what you expect as an acquiring organization. So that requires an evaluation of that smaller organization to understand the factors that contributed from a cultural nuance point of view, the leadership behaviors and how they drive decision making every day. Because what you don't want to do as an acquired organization is minimize the valuation because you've blown up all the things that have led to their success, right? So there's an evaluation that needs to happen in that small organization, and a intentional connection that's made. Instead of this is our culture, and because we're the billion-dollar institution, you don't get to bring what you, right? That's not a way to really integrate an organization into the bigger picture. But that also requires the larger organization to be clear about what is the culture. Can I articulate it? Because you want to be able to scale that. That's why you need the system. Define values, behavioral standards, blah, blah, blah. And then I always say it's the with them. What's in it for me? Because if I can give you that message in a way that brings you along, I'm going to do that. What's in it for me? Well, by being acquired by us, here are the things that come with that. And from a cultural standpoint, your adoption of these things aren't very different from what you're doing that drives your success. But guess what we are going to do? We're going to fix the things that have led to your failures in the business when you adopt these new way of doing, new way of thinking. And most acquiring organizations are so focused on all the other systems and processes and transitions that they lose sight of the with them. It's like bringing anyone along. Why? You know, I had one client, they changed my acronym. It's still with them, but the words are different. But at the end of the day, it is important to be clear about that message. Even in your own organization, if you're reinforcing all these values and why it's important and why we're changing the way we do things, a person who you want alignment or buy into that needs to understand what's in it for me. Why does this matter, right? So hopefully that sort of addresses your question. But if we can engage in more deeper or strategic dialogue offline about that, because we do work with organizations in M&A scenario.
Okay, well, I think we are running to the end of our programming. Jen, do we have any online questions that we haven't addressed? Okay, well, I am going to ask you one parting open question, which is, you know, if you could leave our audience online and here in the room with us today with one parting piece of advice on how they can get started on this journey to identify and create a culture, performance management culture, you know, what's that one tip?
I don't do any. Leah, you know me, Lord. I don't know how to answer my name and what. Okay.
One tip.
One tip. Call CultureWorx. www.getcultureworks.com. No. One tip. I would recommend taking the culture change agents, the senior most leaders in your organization, if you're a senior most leader in your organization, and fostering a open, honest, reflective, conversation about the current state of your workplace culture. No delusion. Take the picture frames off the wall if that's distracting in your conference room. Now, I'm not talking about your employee engagement survey results from last year. I'm not talking about the Forbes distinction that you got because you paid for it. Right? I'm talking about some real honest, you know what? We're going to take our jackets off. We're going to lower the blinds. And listen, I'm going to preface this, boss, by, what I may say, please, there's no retaliation. And we're going to have a hard conversation and look at it. Because it has to start there, right? Before you can truly embark upon this culture transformation that you may truly want, or maybe you don't want, but you must realize that the shift is happening in the marketplace. You have to do something about it. You have suppliers now challenging organizations. Show and prove. You have your customers validating or asking you to validate this culture you claim. Now you have talent in the marketplace saying, don't tell me about wages. There's wage compression everywhere. Tell me about the experience. So now's the time to take that honest, self-reflective look and say, okay, you know what, we are broken. We got to do some things better. We need a system, and then from there, y'all got the website.
Sir, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.